What you think you told me, or maybe you think I'm somebody else.
Welcome to the Public House Podcast.
Now serving behavioral science and officer memory.
I'm Dr. John O'Neill.
And I'm Dr. Don O'Neill. Today we're going to talk about officer memory and misconceptions involved in officer memory, as well as the reality of not only how officers remember things, but how all of us humans remember things, because humans are fallible. And we'll be discussing some factors that hinder as well as help memory and a behavioral conceptualization of memory.
Except for me, I am infallible. So memory has become sort of a colloquial term that's thrown around by the general public without a technical understanding of what memory is supposed to be. And in fact, when you look into the memory scientific literature, memory itself as a term is not often defined in research articles because it's become such a ubiquitous term.
Yeah, and we have written articles on officer memory, and so one of the first things we did is looked into the mainstream psychological literature to try and find, well, how is it defined? As behavior analysts, we always start with our operational definitions, and we were surprised, perhaps we shouldn't be, that it's not often defined even in all of the studies that are measuring memory. It's very difficult because it's, I guess, taken for granted of everyone understands what memory is. And so that was problematic for us. And we looked back into the behavior analytic literature, and it does offer a conceptualization, many different conceptualizations and definitions of memory. So for our purposes today, we're defining memory as the act of remembering, of thinking, or problem solving, and the absence of the original eliciting or discriminative stimulus. So Donahoe and Palmer have done a lot of work on memory. Skinner conceptualized it back in the 50s, and White has done a lot of different conceptualizations as well. And what makes behaviorism different from mainstream psychology or cognitive approaches is that we're describing memory as a private event, a private activity that's only privy to the individual that's experiencing these thoughts, this problem solving, these acts of remembering, this internal dialogue, if you will, and that these private events, they serve as links in a causal chain of events, but they're not initiating causes of overt forms of behavior. So I think mainstream, a lot of people think that thoughts cause actions, that how I think, what I think is going to cause my behavior. And rather it's that behavior analysts have thought about this as a self-rule. So when we think things to ourselves, we might be engaging in a self-rule, and that self-rule might precede and evoke behavior, but only because that rule is tied to an organism's learning history, and as such it develops from contingencies mediated by the organism's verbal community, right? So it has a history of reinforcement that goes back into the environment, as opposed to being something that's held in the person's brain or in the mind's eye. Do you have anything to add to that, John?
Yeah, I think in the scientific literature outside of behavioral science, it's often referred to in dualistic terms, so the mind and body being separate and distinguishable entities, and then also referring to memory as an independent variable or something that influences a dependent variable, as opposed to, as behavior analysts would typically look at it, as a dependent variable. So yeah, an interesting difference between how behavior analysts and other scientists might approach the concept of memory.
And behavior analysts have different conceptualizations of memory. So I'm going to go through those before we talk about memory in law enforcement. So Palmer has different conceptualizations. A very popular one is that memory is a form of stimulus control, in which it's under the direct control of stimuli or sets of stimuli in the environment, and that develops by exposure to contingencies of reinforcement under motivating conditions, and then forgetting as a form of loss of stimulus control. However, this forgetting process has not been formally documented in the literature by behavior analysts, so it's more theoretical in nature, and it's very difficult to study memory because we can't see it directly. So anytime we're measuring a dependent variable, we're looking at an indirect assessment of memory. So there's memory as stimulus control. There's also memory as problem solving. And the problem occurs when a solution is part of the organism's repertoire. Discriminative stimuli are present to signal the availability of reinforcement, and the response is not under the direct control of the currently presented discriminative stimuli. So that's interesting as well. And Palmer talks a lot about different forms of intermediary behavior that can occur during the problem-solving process, and different stimuli that a person can use in their environment, such as using Siri, Google Maps, or something to get somewhere, to remember how to get somewhere. You can use different prompts. You can look at a map or use an app these days, and I think in the literature they talk about using an atlas, but that time has come and gone. Maybe there are a few of you out there still using an atlas to get around. Hopefully not. But that there are different problem-solving behaviors that can occur that he calls intermediary behaviors. And then White moves the discussion further by combining delay and stimulus conditions in the conceptualization of memory. Because problem-solving and stimulus control, when we look at memory that way, we're not looking at or emphasizing the time lapse between the stimulus and the response, or between the presentation of a reinforcer and another stimulus presentation. So White argues that the time lapse between original training and the act of remembering is actually the most important variable in a retention interval. So he talks about memory in the context of discrimination as well as generalization, in which accurate remembering involves delayed stimulus control because of the lapse in time. So I think we could think about this in terms of delayed matching to sampled tasks and just stretching those out over longer and longer retention intervals. Mm-hmm. So now that we've discussed memory with a behavioral conceptualization, we've defined it behaviorally, we understand that we're not talking about hypothetical constructs, we're not talking about memory in the officer's mind being stored and retrieved there later. We're talking about processes that go back to the organism's learning history and responses that have been mediated by the verbal community. I think we can then move on to misconceptions of memory, specifically related to law enforcement. Anything to add?
So if you were to simplify it, for anyone who's not a behavior analyst out there, memory is the ability to engage in some behavior in the absence of the relevant stimuli. So if I ask you a question about something you saw yesterday, you're able to respond and engage in behavior relevant to that stimulus while no longer in the presence of it.
Which ties into the first misconception, that humans can perfectly recall events. So I'm going to list these misconceptions first, and then we'll talk about data and reality. All right, so that's the first misconception that some people hold. Perhaps this isn't true for all of you that are listening. Another is that officers can perceive and attend to all critical stimuli in their environment at once. A third, that we can function just fine on just a few hours of sleep. The fourth, that an officer's confidence in his or her memory equates to accuracy. So confidence equals accuracy. A fifth misconception is that when videotape is different than an officer's account, the officer must be lying, deceiving, or purposefully omitting information. So these are the 5 main misconceptions. There are more that we'll focus on today. So let's go back to the first misconceptions, that humans or officers can perfectly recall events. The reality is that humans are poor historians at remembering their own behavior. And we can take this outside of the context of law enforcement and just think about, for behavior analysts out there, anytime that you've done an indirect assessment, collateral interview with a family member, a parent, a guardian, and you ask about their loved one's behaviors, how difficult it is for them to recall specifics on the frequency and intensity of the behavior, and how their self-report to you might be very different than using an actual data system to record behavior on some sort of interval system. And we can see that it's very different. I think that's one of the first things we learn in graduate school and any sort of single case subject design you might have had, is that humans are poor historians of their behavior. And this is widely held in different research articles on memory across disciplines, where it's quite an anomaly to have anyone that can remember things perfectly. In fact, those are extreme outliers, and those people are studied intensely for having, picture perfect memory.
Yeah, and it depends what type of memory-related practice you've engaged in as well, right? So, for example, I'm really good at remembering details of things like cars or rock climbing routes, those things that I have a lot of practice in remembering and engaging in behaviors relevant to those practices. So I think the same is true for officers. If during police academy training they're exposed to a lot of memory tasks where they have to remember certain details like a hidden hand or the type of weapon that's being presented or the movement of a subject, if they engage in a lot of practice relevant to those behaviors, they're probably more likely to accurately remember details about those particular characteristics as opposed to other characteristics that maybe they haven't practiced much or at all in the past.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to practice effects towards the end of today when we talk about factors that can help facilitate memory. All right, the second misconception is that officers can perceive and attend to all critical stimuli in their environment at once. And this is an important misconception as more and more people start to videotape encounters between law enforcement and the public, and they might see something from a different angle, of course, than what the officer is experiencing at the time, and they might see information that the officer is not able to perceive and attend to. And this relates to research that John and I were a part of. We did a very large traffic stop study many years ago, and we were looking at the path of travel and movement of the officer, but a subsequent analysis of that was just looking at memory of the encounter. So we had the officers do a free recall task where we asked them to write down everything they could remember about that before, during, and after the subject used lethal force. And one of the largest takeaways was that the officers that reported more details related to verbal behavior were substantially less likely to recall critical information related to the event. Specifically, I'm talking about the driver's hidden right hand. So that critical information that John referred to earlier is very important.
So, for example, during a traffic stop, if the officer is paying attention to the verbal interaction, all of the verbal details, the back and forth between themselves and the subject, they may not be paying attention to other physical details like their position in relation to the other person, the type of car they're driving, license plates, perhaps there are potential weapons that are within view inside of the car, but the officer is making eye contact and paying more attention to the conversation than the physical attributes of the environment. So that's just a simple example of how the officer's focus of attention during a traffic stop, for example, might determine what sort of details they remember after the fact.
Mm-hmm. All right, moving on to the third misconception. So you might have heard it before when people say, I function just fine on a few hours of sleep. And this misconception is very important in terms of memory because lack of sleep can very much disturb memory. And we can function okay when we're not faced with any sort of unexpected stimuli in our environment, but we have a delayed reaction time and we engage in more errors when we are actually presented with unexpected stimuli, when we stay up for multiple hours at a time. And there's some really cool research that was done all the way back in the 90s, just comparing duration of wakefulness to alcohol intake, because the researchers wanted to know, if we stay up for, let's say, 24 hours and we systematically do different assessments over that period of 24 hours, what happens to accuracy and coordination and everything over time, and let's compare that to alcohol intake. So they kind of did a yoke control with both groups, and they found that once you get to like 17 hours to 24 hours, you're behaving very similarly to someone who has a blood alcohol content of 0.05 to 0.10.
Yeah, so they typically pick up overtime. They may work long shifts, right? 12-hour shifts sometimes. So yeah, the cumulative effect of fatigue and stress really haven't been examined very thoroughly within the context of law enforcement and police schedules and the job of policing, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, and then there's all sorts of negative side effects that come with shift work and people that work all different hours, and how it can mess up our circadian rhythm and our sleep-wake cycle, and then that impacts performance the next day, which therefore impacts memory.
Yeah, and the literature outside of behavior analysis suggests that sleep itself is a determining factor in short and long-term memory, in particular long-term memory. They refer to it as consolidation. But I think that in our literature reviews of the psychological literature and the stress literature suggest that it's not yet entirely clear if memory deficits are due to the, again, cumulative stress of fatigue, or if sleep directly modulates our ability to remember.
Absolutely. So I think that's really a research question that needs to be answered in the future. Is it the lack of sleep? Is it the sleep deprivation that results in more errors? Or is it that sleep facilitates better learning?
Right.
And better recall? Or perhaps both can be true.
Perhaps.
All right, the fourth misconception is that confidence of a memory equals accuracy for that memory. And it seems common sense. Like, if someone's really confident about their recall of an incident, then it's probably accurate, but this is not true. And numerous studies have demonstrated, outside of behavior analysis, that confidence does not correlate with accuracy. And some researchers outside of behavior analysis believe that each time we recall information, we are actually recalling the last time we've engaged in verbal behavior about that information. So we're remembering our last bit of verbal behavior as opposed to the actual incident or event or the stimulus when we first came into contact with it.
Yeah, you think about what's it called, the telephone game?
Yeah.
Where you hear a message and you pass it on to the next person, then they pass it on to the next person, and by the time you get to the end of the line, it's a completely different message than the original message. Is that sort of similar in that the officer is remembering their last so maybe they're remembering the verbal interaction that they had with the first officer on the scene after an incident, and of course everything that happens after the incident itself, between the incident and an interview, is going to affect that officer's memory of that event too, especially if they had conversations with other officers or other conversations with different interviewers. And we know that interviews of officers sometimes occur multiple times, so they have to answer the same question provided by different people multiple times. So that their first and second response might have some impact on their memory and subsequent response the third time.
Yeah, and Ed Geiselman has done a lot of research on memory, including officer memory, and he has stated in several discussions of different papers that the more opportunities you provide for someone to recall an incident, the more and more you can expect that there are going to be differences, that there are going to be omissions, there are going to be errors, and there's going to be new information as well. And in fact, he says you can almost guarantee it because there's no way, we're not robots or computers or machines. We cannot regurgitate the same information trial after trial after trial after different delays in time and after different events have occurred after we've been presented with all different stimuli. And it's not only recalling that information again and again and again, but think about after a critical incident, is the officer getting medical care? Does that involve taking some form of medications that might impact, memory? Do they stay awake at night now and have trouble sleeping? Is there perhaps a development of a mental health condition that might happen after a critical incident?
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit more and expand on the idea that an officer might be required to answer the same questions or similar questions about an incident multiple times. And from what you're saying, and from Geiselman's research, we might expect that there be discrepancies between answers to the same question. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the officer is lying or being dishonest about something. They may, just because there are discrepancies between time points of responses to questions, doesn't mean that they're being insincere or dishonest. It simply means that the question is being asked under a different context at a different time, and that officer's response may and should be expected to vary.
Yeah, and I think, in fact, Geiselman maybe, or someone else, I don't want to misattribute it, but said that if an officer's statement didn't change at all, that might be more of an indication that a person is lying than if it does change, because that's typical human behavior, is that our verbal behavior changes over time.
And even then, the officer might simply be giving a scripted response that they have practiced, knowing that they were going to be asked certain questions. So they've scripted an accurate representation of their experience during the incident, and they're sticking to that description. So, I mean, whether or not there are discrepancies between answers, it should all be considered useful information, and if there are differences and there are discrepancies, it shouldn't be automatically assumed that the officer is lying. We need to look further into that and see why there might be discrepancies and why there might be additional or information that was not present in one response versus the other.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to talk about the change in context and who's doing the interview and their training, as well as their motivating operations when conducting the interview, because you might have a detective or someone from internal affairs that has been very well trained in the cognitive interview technique, which is used at a lot of different agencies. And one thing that it's known for across populations outside of law enforcement even is that if you want the most quantity and the most quality information to use a cognitive interview above and beyond a lot of different methods, it places the kind of stimulus control in the hands of the person that is recalling the information. It typically takes about 2 hours, and there are a variety of different techniques used within the cognitive interview to help evoke more accurate and more amounts of verbal behavior.
And one of the most interesting pieces of that for behavior analysts, I think, is something that they refer to as context reinstatement. Mm-hmm. And basically all that comes down to is placing the officer, if they can physically, but if not, setting the stage for the officer's response to be conducted in an environment that is as close to, if not exactly, the context in which the incident occurred. So they may take them back to the scene of the crime or the scene of the incident. They'll do a walk around and talk through their behavior in relation to the officer or the subject. If that's not possible, then the interviewer might tell a brief story that sets the stage for and attempts to, quote-unquote, bring the officer back to the context in which the incident occurred.
Mm-hmm. And another procedure that's used relates to perspective taking, and to change the perspective of the officer at the time of the interview to say, okay, now put yourself in a different location during the critical incident. Tell me what you can see from that position. Tell me what you can hear, what sensations, and then go through all the different senses as well from these different perspectives. The context reinstatement is key. Another piece of this that also relates to potential deceptiveness is going backwards. Now walk me through the incident, but we're going to go backwards in time as opposed to forwards.
Yeah, I remember that being a piece that they used to try to highlight or identify either incorrect or untruthful statements. So if there's a discrepancy between the way the officer reports the incident going in normal forward time and describing the incident in reverse, then that may be something to look into a little deeper to see why there was a discrepancy. Is the officer being untruthful, or does playing the incident backwards in their quote-unquote minds, does that evoke certain other verbal descriptions of the event?
Mm-hmm. And another aspect of the cognitive interview is the narrative, that it's outside of behavior analysis, it's called a free recall, but you're basically asking the person to spend as much time as they can recalling the incident in their own words in as much detail and as thoroughly and accurately as possible. And during that time, the interviewer does not interrupt. They take notes, and they say ahead of time, I'm going to be taking notes so I can ask you follow-up questions afterwards. But in the memory literature, it's known that if you constantly interrupt someone when they're telling a story, perhaps this has happened with your significant others, and they're trying to make a point, and then you interrupt them, and they're like, oh, man, I don't remember what I was saying anymore. So if you want to
wait, sorry, what was that?
Yeah, I can't remember now. No. If you want to facilitate an accuracy, right, then you should interrupt. So the opposite of that is true for the cognitive interview, which might also lend to its successfulness in gathering the most accurate information. But in talking about context and who's doing the interview, if it's an attorney, if it's someone with a different motivating operation for what kind of information they're trying to gather from the person, the interviewee, then they might interrupt a lot. They might ask leading questions, and as opposed to an open-ended question. A leading question is trying to direct or lead the person to respond in a specific way. And that can influence then the verbal behavior of the interviewee to respond in a way that's dictated by the interviewer. So that can lead to a coercive interview or inaccurate information during the interview process. So memory is also under the conditions of the stimuli in the environment at the time that the information is being asked for, such as during an interview after a critical incident.
Yeah, and that's why viewing video footage is a little bit controversial, and there's discussion around when and if videos of the incident should be reviewed by the officer involved. I think if you want to get all the details and you're not concerned with whether or not the officer is being untruthful, then you would ask them to do a complete free recall, no interruptions, no questions, just get their entire account. Then you might show them the video. Okay, now tell me give me the description of the event, having viewed the video footage. And then after that, you might conduct another one where you have specific questions. Okay, what was happening here? Why did you do this? Why did you respond to the subject in this manner? But that's if we're not concerned about the officer potentially being at fault for excessive use of force, for example. So there are a lot of questions and controversy around whether or not officers should view footage of incidents that they were involved in. Typically because the officer gets a different perspective, they see things that they may or may not have seen during the actual event. So it could really go to the officer's advantage, but it could also go to the officer's disadvantage because they might see themselves engage in something or see the subject engage in something that they didn't actually attend to during the actual incident, but now they have sort of a false memory of the event because they're viewing footage after the fact.
Mm-hmm. It's perhaps that their memory becomes kind of prompt dependent, and the prompt being the video review. So now that they've seen the video, they can never unsee it, and that's going to influence their recall further. I know for departments, something that's difficult is if you take the officer's statement before and after video review, you can definitely expect there are going to be changes after seeing the video. And that can be used against the officer to say, look, you changed what you said before and after video review. So although the information might be more complete and more accurate after video review, it might appear as though the officer was initially omitting information or purposely being deceptive. And so memory is, it's so complex. And we're not trying to say one way or other of what, is the officer telling the truth or not, but rather to look at the factors of this form of verbal behavior to look at what can both hinder and help memory.
Yeah, another example would be the officer providing details about their position and their path of travel, for example, prior to watching a video footage, then seeing the video footage and realizing, oh, that wasn't actually my path of travel, and I was actually over here when the incident started, slightly different. So they might change their response to a question, and then that might in turn look like they either omitted or were being dishonest with their first response, but in actual fact, the additional stimuli of the video prompted a different response.
That's right. So this relates to the fifth misconception of when officer memory is different than that of video footage, and the assumption that automatically means the officer must be lying, deceiving, or purposefully omitting information. And so we're suggesting that based off of research, scenario-based training, that's realistic scenarios, and even after some interviews, candid interviews with officer after officer-involved shootings have been published, and the recall is never perfect. In scenario-based training, the path of travel was off by 10 to 20%. If we look at candid interviews of officers after officer-involved shootings, Dr. Alexis Artwall is a retired police psychologist, and she's published some of her interviews with officers who didn't recall unholstering, didn't require firing their duty weapon, and really struggled with that after the fact. And I'm not saying this is a common occurrence, but it's a possibility.
Typically under extremely stressful situations. And she did quite a bit of analysis of the officer interviews that she did, and what was relatively common was some sort of perceptual distortion. Mm-hmm. So, for example, tunnel vision. Mm-hmm. I'm sure a lot of the listeners have experienced that while playing sports or during a car accident, for example. Things tend to slow down, or at least you perceive them to be slowing down or speeding up. And the same is true of auditory stimuli. You may or may not remember or even attend to certain auditory stimuli under highly stressful situations. And those can all affect your memory of that event.
Absolutely. Right, so different perceptual distortions occur and are common for officers as well as anyone that's under extreme forms of stress. So now that we've discussed our 5 misconceptions, I want to talk a little bit more about the factors that hinder memory. And we've touched on a lot of these, so we'll just cover them briefly here. So one of the main factors, as we've been discussing, is the period of wakefulness. So this relates to fatigue or lack of sleep, which is very common in officers because of their shift work and working so many hours, that sleep and lack of sleep, they might be used to functioning at sort of baseline on a day-to-day basis, but then if a critical incident were to arise and a use of force, perhaps lethal force, were to occur on top of a lack of sleep, that can negatively impact memory. A second factor that hinders memory is too much stress or arousal. And there are different forms of stress. So let's take the same topography of a behavior. An increase in heart rate can happen across different contexts, across different setting events, and in response to different stimuli. So think of an officer who's approaching someone's door and has to provide a notice to a loved one that their family member is deceased, and there's an increase in heart rate, there's an increase in arousal, versus an increase in heart rate due to an officer engaged in a foot pursuit, which is chasing a subject, and then having to go hands-on in an all-out fight. And maybe there's a struggle for the subject's weapon, maybe the subject is struggling for the officer's weapon, and that also results in an increase in heart rate. So it's an increase in arousal. And there's a thing called an inverted U curve of looking at performance versus arousal, and that there's this sort of sweet spot where athletes, officers, people function very well with some arousal. Even think about being a student, being back in grad school, and having some arousal or stress related to needing to do well on a test. And if you have a little bit of arousal, okay, you might have more of a motivating operation to complete more studying behavior that's going to lead to doing better on an exam. But if you have a lot of arousal and a lot of stress and you have difficulty concentrating and your performance isn't as good when you're studying, maybe you didn't study and now it's test time, you're going to perform very poorly. And similarly to law enforcement work during these critical incidents, if arousal is very high, it can really negatively impact memory.
Right, so the general idea is that during these critical incidents, you obviously don't want the officer to be completely devoid of arousal or stress hormones, but on the other end of the spectrum, you don't want them completely overloaded with stress hormones. So basically, when you're talking about the inverted U, you want officers during a critical incident to have some level of stress hormones. You want them active and ready to respond to the incident. You don't want them completely unaroused and not paying attention to the situation as it develops. But on the other end of the spectrum, you don't want them to choke because of extremely high levels of stress hormones in their body during the event as well. So as you said, somewhere in there's a sweet spot for the level of stress and stimulation that the officer needs in order to have some level of accurate memory of the event.
Mm-hmm. And some research has pointed to officers with more elite forms of training have reduced arousal and very high performance. But part of that is their exposure to these different stimuli and job-based tasks to a point of fluency, of being able to perform actions quickly and accurately, and being able to engage in better recall than after the fact.
Right.
All right, so another factor that hinders memory is concentration on a specific stimulus or stimuli. And so earlier we talked about different stimuli Like if an officer is really focused on a conversation, they might not report a weapon that was visible or critical information like a driver's hidden right hand. And there are phenomena that are studied called inattentional blindness and inattentional deafness. And John and I did some work on inattentional blindness. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. I mean, the general idea is that you can be in the present and have stressful or stress-evoking or threat stimuli within your field of vision and not necessarily attend to it because your focus of attention is on, for example, the verbal interaction that you're having with someone. So it really comes down to what you're attending to and what you're paying attention to during a critical event.
Mm-hmm. And so you may or may not, taking it outside of law enforcement, be aware of the Guerrilla Study and intentional blindness, in which I believe a lot of participants at first were college students, and they were asked to count the basketball passes for individuals wearing black T-shirts in a circle in a group with some other people that were wearing white T-shirts. And then in the midst of this task of counting basketball passes, a person in a gorilla suit, which is also a black gorilla suit, was going through the scene, pounding his chest, and then walking off scene. And the participants that were studying or counting the basketball passes for people wearing black T-shirts, the same color as the gorilla suit, they were far less likely to notice the gorilla than individuals that were just sitting back and watching the whole incident. So it reminds me, not only is that a demonstration of unintentional blindness, if people missed the gorilla and then they couldn't believe it afterwards, showing the video again, okay, now take a look again. Oh, there's the gorilla. How did I ever miss that? Well, it's because they were focusing on a different set of stimuli.
So something else that might affect an officer's memory of an event is their focus of attention during the incident. So there's a researcher by the name of Nidifer that has talked about quadrants of attention. He talks generally about internal versus external focus of attention. Internal being a focus on the officer's behavior themselves, so how they're speaking to the individual, their body movements, their position in relation to the subject, versus an external focus of attention on the behavior, movements, and verbal responses of the subject. So something outside of the officer in the environment, if you will. The other piece of the quadrant is narrow versus broad focus of attention. So a narrow focus of attention would be on very specific details. So if the officer notices that there's a concealed weapon of some sort, they might narrowly focus on that particular stimulus, as opposed to a broad focus of attention where they're paying attention to the general environment and are more open, presumably, to other forms of stimuli. Let's say there's a second subject off in their peripheral vision. The officer may not pick up or pay attention or remember that other subject if they don't have a broad focus of attention at some point during the incident. So I think this is relevant to training as well. We want officers to be able to transition from internal to external focus of attention, from narrow to broad focus of attention, and be able to fluidly move back and forth as the situation requires, so that they can pick up on potential threat stimuli, but also are generally aware of everything that's going on around them as well, and not having tunnel vision, as it were, on the subject and nothing else that's going on around them.
Which would need to be trained, because as humans we're looking to survive. We're looking for the survival of value, so that related, that stimulus of a firearm being pointed at you you're going to have an external narrow focus on that firearm, but then to be able to go and broaden that focus, okay, but what else is going on in the environment too? Where can officers seek cover or concealment is also important, but that would need to be trained because we're looking to survive, and so automatically our attention, our focus of attention, and officers would be going to the firearm.
How convenient that there was a police siren going off in the background.
Yes. Perfect.
Yeah, so it's entirely plausible that officers, when placed in a situation like a traffic stop that they have a lot of experience in and a lot of training and practice in particular behaviors relevant to the traffic stop, when an unexpected stimulus is presented, there's a chance that the officer misses that stimulus because they're so used to attending to the other variables and the other stimuli in that environment.
Mm-hmm. And there's been research, believe it or not, on nails on a chalkboard and studying inattentional deafness and having participants concentrate on a type of information, a dialogue going on between two people, and when they were supposed to focus on the dialogue that was happening in that specific auditory stimulus, they were far less likely to recall nails on a chalkboard after the fact. And then they were like, okay, maybe they just weren't attending, but maybe subjectively it impacted their emotional state because that's such an aversive stimulus. But even the author's attempts to look at just feeling different after the task was no different for nails on a chalkboard and being exposed to that or not, which is very interesting to not even have that subjective, that recalling a subjective experience or a change in it.
Yeah, so there was actually a study conducted to look at this, and some of the findings did suggest that during a traffic stop scenario, even experienced officers would miss an obvious handgun placed on the dash of the car that they were approaching. So that's just an example of how the officer's focus of attention during those sorts of situations can have an effect on what they are able to recall about the event after the fact, and even what they can recognize in the moment during the scenario.
So this relates very well to factors that facilitate memory during high-stress incidents, because in that research study on inattentional blindness, new officers with less training were far less likely to observe and report the firearm on the dash during the traffic stop than seasoned officers with more experience and more training. So it was about a third of the seasoned officers with more training that didn't recall the firearm that was right on the dash.
So this suggests that memory for these type of events can be affected through training, and that we can increase an officer's ability to recall certain types of details and pay attention to certain types of details during these critical events.
Right, so it was a third of the officers didn't recall that were seasoned officers with more training, and 2/3 of the younger officers. So that really demonstrates such a large difference between 33% and close to 67% between these two groups. And we found that again and again across studies that training, elite training, makes a world of difference in being able to remember the information. Another study conducted in London looked at elite drivers who went through a special class and had obtained the highest level of certification for pursuit driving in the London area, and compared it to regular response driving of just responding to a critical incident versus officers with no training. And systematically, from no training to some training to the best training, they recalled more information that was relevant to policing. They recalled more details related to radio transmissions and more dash cam footage. However, what remained the same across all groups was memory of general items, just general words and general pictures. So that suggests that these different training groups, it wasn't as if individuals with more training were somehow smarter or better at recall, higher performers overall. It was only pertaining to the officer relevant, job specific information.
Which is good.
Which is great, which is why it's so frustrating for trainers and individuals exposed and knowledgeable to training, because it's the first thing to be cut in the budget for officers across the country for their departments. Training is often one of the first that's hit, and yet we know from research that training is one area that should be invested in the most.
Yeah, and I think that has implications for an officer's response to interview questions after a critical incident as well. If they have a long history of training that involves scenarios and specific feedback on paying attention to particular details, threats, stimuli, that sort of thing, then we might expect their verbal report to be more accurate for those types of details than for example, a novice officer who has much less training.
And so, in summation, the alternative of our misconceptions are that humans are not perfectly able to recall events. There's no way we can perceive and attend to all critical stimuli in the environment at once. We can function just fine on a few hours of sleep unless we're thrown a curveball and presented with unexpected, aversive, critical stimuli in our environment that elicit a large degree of arousal or stress. That confidence does not necessarily equate to accuracy of memory, and that we can expect videotape to be different than an officer's account of an encounter, and that the more times the officer engages in verbal behavior regarding that encounter, the more likely we're going to see differences.
Yeah, and to add to that, officers with a different perspective from operating from a different location during an incident are obviously going to see slightly different angles, and perhaps one officer sees a hidden weapon whereas the other does not, and their memory and response during the incident is different than somebody who was also there but experienced the event from a different perspective.
And the one thing that's known across research studies to benefit memory is more training.
All right, that's been our discussion of police officer memory, and we will see you on the next episode of the Public House Podcast.
Maybe you think I'm somebody else.